Humans left in silence, and the council realized their worst fear was real. The vote took 11 seconds. I know because I counted every one of them from the moment Chairman Arev called the motion to the moment the last light pulse from the solvent delegate faded in the upper gallery. 11 species. 11 raised signals, hands, tendrils, translucent fins, glowing patches of skin that served as formal gesture among the solvent. 11 forms of life with 11 different biologies and 11 different histories all arriving at the same answer at the same time. The motion passed. Humanity was removed from the Galactic Accord Council effective immediately, pending a review period of 40 standard cycles. They called it a review period. I wrote that phrase down in my paper notebook in plain ink while Secretary Venn was still reading the motion aloud. The Kreth delegate to my left had been watching my notebook since the session opened. The Kreth use implanted neural recording systems. The concept of pressing a stick made from organic material against dried pulp to preserve information clearly struck him as a primitive act. He watched my pen the way you watch someone build a fire with 2 rocks when there are electric lighters on the table. I pressed the pen harder and wrote a little slower. Secretary Venn finished reading the formal charges. Venn was Lorian, and Lorian voices always carry that particular quality of gravel in a metal drum, which made everything he said sound heavier and more official than it perhaps needed to be. The charges were 4 in number. The first, destabilizing influence on council proceedings. The second, generation of unpredictable threat vectors across 3 monitored sectors. The third, failure to conform to Accord behavioral standards as outlined in the founding charter, Articles 4 through 11. The fourth, which Venn read approximately 15% faster than the others, persistent refusal to limit strategic and technological development within mutually agreed parameters. That fourth one was the honest charge. The first 3 were written to make the fourth one look less like what it actually was, which was fear. My name is Yara Voss. I have served as Earth's Ambassador Commander to the Galactic Accord Council for 9 years, 4 months, and 6 days. Before the ambassadorial post, I commanded rapid response operations during the Outer Reach conflict. The Accord's official record describes that conflict as a prolonged border dispute. Anyone who was in the outer sectors during years 4 through 7 of that conflict would describe it differently, and most of them would use considerably shorter words to do it. I am 46 years old. In my career, I have communicated with alien species through formal language, body posture, color-coded diplomatic light panels, breath exchange greetings that required 3 days of medical preparation, and once through 40 unbroken minutes of synchronized silence with a delegate from a species that considers verbal language to be aggressive and rude. I have spent my entire adult life learning how to speak to the galaxy. And right now, not one person in that chamber was speaking to me. The 6 Verosi security officers stationed at the exits shifted their collective weight. I noticed it the way you notice a very slight change in the pressure of a room, not because you were looking for it, but because you stopped being able to not notice things like that a long time ago. The Verosi are large in the way that certain structures are large, not surprising, but impossible to ignore. They wear their natural exoskeleton-like armor because for them there is no difference between the two. Their names were Doss, Karin, Yelt, Prith, Mav, and Solon. I had made a point of learning their names 3 months ago during a routine security orientation that I was the only diplomat in the building to attend in person. Doss had nodded when I used his name that first day. He nodded again now. Small movement. Clear meaning. I capped my pen. Chairman Arev had gone the particular shade of pale copper that Thren produce when a source of prolonged stress has been removed. I had spent 2 years learning the Thren chromatic language in private, through materials that were not available through Accord-sanctioned diplomatic training. Arev had no idea I could read the color on his membrane. Copper was relief. It was also the color of a person who had expected a much larger problem and was pleasantly surprised to be wrong. I stood up from the delegation table. The chamber produced one of those silences that is not actually quiet, it is the sound of many people deciding simultaneously to stop making noise, which has its own texture and weight entirely. I have no formal objection to register, I said. My voice was even. Not flat, even. Flat is what defeat sounds like. Even is what someone sounds like when they have already moved past the current moment and are thinking about the next one. I will note for the record that the fourth charge is the accurate and honest one and the first 3 are political framing. I trust the archive will reflect that distinction in time. Secretary Venn drew in a breath in preparation for a response. I did not slow down. Earth will comply fully with the terms of the review period. All diplomatic channels will be suspended per the motion's provisions. Human vessels will vacate shared transit corridors within the designated departure window. I picked up the notebook. We appreciate the time and consideration of the full council. I walked toward the exit. The environmental system hummed. Doss's exoskeleton made the faint grinding sound that Verosi joints produce under slight movement. Chairman Arev's membrane clicked. Thren do that when they are processing something they cannot yet say out loud. At the chamber door I stopped. I turned my head just far enough for my voice to carry across the full room. Enjoy the quiet, I said. I walked out. Cole Merritt was in the corridor with his arms crossed and his face set in the expression he used when he had known exactly how something would go and had decided not to say so in advance. Cole was my deputy, my second chair, and the most deliberately unreadable person I had ever worked with. He was also the best strategic mind in the diplomatic division, which was the reason I had selected him and the reason the Accord's intelligence office had flagged his appointment with mild concern 3 years ago. Mild concern from that office was its own kind of compliment. Done. Cole said. Done, I said. We walked to the departure bay. Our ship, the Meridian, was already prepped. She looked modest from the outside and performed nothing of the sort. The crew of 43 had received the automated departure authorization the moment the vote recorded. I sat in my command chair and opened the notebook to a clean page. I wrote 2 lines. Day 1 of the silence. They think this is a consequence. I closed the notebook and held it for a moment, then looked out through the bridge screen at the Accord station growing smaller as Lena Park brought us smoothly away from the docking ring. Lena was the best pilot in the diplomatic fleet. She moved ships the way good writers move sentences, no wasted motion, everything landing exactly where it was meant to land. The station glittered. Enormous. Busy with the light of 11 species going about business that was, as of 11 seconds ago, no longer any of mine. We had helped build that station. Not symbolically, actually. Human engineers had contributed 11% of the structural framework and 23% of the environmental systems during the initial construction phase. There was no plaque. There was no acknowledgement in the founding charter's appendices. There was a footnote in a technical report filed by the Engineering Liaison Office in year 3 of the project, and I had read that footnote so many times I could recite it from memory. Jump corridor in 41 hours, Lena said without turning around. Clear route. Thank you, I said. The station became a light. Then a point. Then empty space. I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote a question at the top. What are they about to discover they cannot do without us? I wrote for a long time. By the time we reached the jump corridor, I had filled 4 pages and started a 5th. I had not repeated a single entry. The Accord's economic indices rose within 30 days of our departure. I read it in an intercepted Kreth commercial broadwave that our intelligence team picked up during routine monitoring. The Kreth were not trying to hide the information, they were broadcasting it the way you broadcast weather, as simple fact about the state of the world. Markets up. Diplomatic tension indices down. Trade route efficiency improving as human vessels cleared the shared corridors. Our analyst, Nora Pell, brought me the transcript over coffee in the Meridian's small briefing room as we cruised toward home. She set it on the table the way you set down something sharp, carefully, with deliberate placement. Then she sat back and watched me read it. They are celebrating, I said. Yes, Nora said. How long do you think it lasts? Nora picked up her coffee. Ask me again in 6 months. It lasted 4. Month 5, piracy activity in the Kellian transit lanes increased by 61%. The Kellian lanes were a major freight corridor between the Voronhome system and 3 outer trade partners. They had been quiet for 11 years. The Accord's intelligence summary described the increase as anomalous and attributed it to shifting criminal networks in the sector. I added the entry to my notebook. What the summary did not mention, and what our own archived data made very clear, was that human patrol vessels had been making irregular sweeps of the Kellian lanes since year 3 of our Accord membership. Not because we were asked to. Not because there was a treaty provision requiring it. Because there was a problem and the problem needed solving and the vessels happened to be in the area. Nobody had ever thanked us for it. Nobody had ever, apparently, noticed we were doing it. Month 7 brought 2 more piracy surges in sectors where human presence had been routine. The Accord dispatched investigation teams. Investigation teams take time. Time, in those sectors, had a cost that was paid by the freight operators and the colony worlds that depended on supply chains that suddenly had a reliability problem. I was not pleased about the colony worlds. I was also not surprised. Cole brought me the first serious casualty report at month 9. A data pull from Accord medical records, authorized for access by a Vorin research contact who had been quietly sympathetic to Earth's position since year 2 of my post and who had apparently decided that sympathy had a practical value. A respiratory illness had appeared on Vorin Colony 7. Not catastrophic. Not the kind of thing that made headlines outside the affected system. The kind of thing that required a specialized medical response team and a particular class of atmospheric treatment equipment within a reasonably short window. The nearest Accord medical frigate was stationed 19 days away. The standard response time to a colony medical alert in that sector had previously been 7 hours. The difference was a hospital ship. Earth's hospital ship. The Accord had spent 4 years formally objecting to the positioning of that vessel as aggressive and strategically inappropriate. They had used the phrase forward deployment in a context that was meant to sound like an accusation. We had argued. We had explained. Eventually, during my second year in post, we had agreed to move the vessel to a position that satisfied the Accord's comfort levels. That position was 22 days away from Colony 7. The colony had a 7-hour critical window. 18 Vorin died before the response team arrived. I wrote their number in the notebook. Not as data. As a record. A record is different from data. Data is what you use for reports. A record is what you use for history. Cole sat across from me in the briefing room while I wrote. He did not say anything for a long time. How many more entries are going to look like this, he said eventually. I have a list, I said. It is long. How long? Long enough that I have started a second notebook. Cole nodded slowly. Then he said, Owen wants to accelerate the compact timeline. Owen Dale was our point of contact for the Emerging Soul Compact, the framework we had been building for the past 8 months with 31 human-adjacent species who had their own complicated history with the Accord. Human-adjacent was a term the Accord used to describe species that had maintained closer relationships with humanity than with the broader galactic community. They used it the way you use a technical term to avoid saying something more direct. What they meant was, species the Accord had been systematically undervaluing, ignoring, or treating as secondary participants in their own civilization's future. There were more of them than the Accord knew. Or more than the Accord had chosen to know, which is a different problem entirely. Tell Owen to hold the timeline, I said. We do this right or we do not do it. He will not like that. Owen does not have to like it. He has to trust the process. The months kept moving. Year 2, month 3, the Accord's top xenolinguistics team spent 7 months failing to decode a signal recovered from a derelict vessel found drifting at the edge of charted space. The signal was not sophisticated. It was a looped distress call in a compression format that the Earth Linguistic Archive had catalogued in Year 4 of our Accord membership. The decoding key was in a file. The file was in the archive. The archive was accessible to any Accord member in good standing. Humanity was not currently in good standing. Nora showed me the xenolinguistics team's internal report. Buried in the appendices, in the administrative notes section that most people skip, was a single line, Query Earth Language Division. It had been written, filed, and never sent. I looked at that line for a long time. Not because it made me angry. Because it was perfect evidence of the specific kind of foolishness that happens when people let pride do work that intelligence is supposed to do. Year 3 brought a territorial dispute between 2 Accord species, the Preth and the Sulvan, whose overlapping claims at the Garan Belt had been simmering since before humanity joined the Council. The Accord sent mediators. The mediation stalled. They sent more mediators. The mediation continued to stall, expensively and with increasing tension. Human diplomatic teams had been involved in 14 territorial mediations between Accord species over the 9 years of my post. We had a method. Not a secret method, we had published it in the Accord's procedural library in Year 2. It was read by 7 people. 3 of them were human. I watched the dispute from across the silence and said nothing. Cole watched me not say anything. You could send a message, he said. They know where to find us, I said. They did not send a message. The dispute reached its 3rd year before it was resolved, at a cost in displaced population and destroyed trade infrastructure that I calculated at the equivalent of a small war. I added the number to the notebook. Year 5, I finished the third notebook and started the fourth. Year 8, the Sol compact had grown from 31 species to 44. Owen Dale sent me a summary report that was technically a status update but read like a person who had stopped being nervous and started being quietly electrified. 44 species. A combined economic output that the Accord had not modeled because the Accord had not imagined the configuration existing. A shared security framework that had reduced incident rates in Sol compact space to levels the Accord's own sectors could not match. And a drive technology program that I asked Adrian Cross, our chief development coordinator, to summarize for me in plain language. Adrian sat in the briefing room and put his hands flat on the table and said, "We have been traveling at approximately 40% of our actual capability for 11 years. I waited. Speed limits, he said. The way he said it made the phrase sound like the name of a very old and very expensive mistake. We limited our development to stay in formation with Accord standards. Not because we had to. Because we thought it was the right thing to do diplomatically. And now?" I said. "Now," Adrian said, "we are not doing that anymore." I wrote one line in the notebook. Year 8, month 2, we stopped apologizing for what we are. There is a specific kind of person who, when told to go sit in the corner and think about what they have done, uses the time to redesign the room. We redesigned the room. The Sol Compact's founding documents do not look like a government charter. They do not look like a military alliance. They look, at first reading, like a mutual development agreement, a collection of resource sharing and technology exchange provisions that could be mistaken for standard economic partnership treaties. Deliberately. The language was Owen Dale's work, and Owen had a particular talent for writing things that could be read two different ways depending on what you were looking for. If you were looking for a threat, you would not find one. If you were looking for a foundation, it was right there. 44 species. Not the largest species in the galaxy. Not the most technologically advanced individually, though that gap was closing with intent. What they were was a collection of peoples who had all, at various points, been told by the Accord that their development timeline needed to slow down, or their territorial ambitions needed to be contained, or their cultural practices needed to be assessed for compatibility with Accord community standards. People who had been told to sit in the corner. We had a great deal in common. Diana Fenn was running the archive project out of a research center on Earth's second orbital platform. Diana was methodical in a way that some people find exhausting and I find deeply reassuring. She had been working for 6 years on a comprehensive documentation effort, every unattributed human contribution to Accord infrastructure, every suppressed research finding, every joint project whose outcome was listed under a different species name in the official record, every preventative action we had taken quietly that the Accord had benefited from without ever thinking to ask who was responsible. I visited the platform in Year 9 and walked through the archive reading room for 3 hours. It was a very large room. "How much is here?" I asked. "We stopped counting volume," Diana said, "and started categorizing by impact." And she handed me a summary file. I read the first page and looked up at her. "They have no idea," I said. "They had every opportunity to know," she said. "They chose not to look." There is a difference between ignorance and the choice not to examine something. I had been thinking about that difference for 9 years. Diana had built a room full of the evidence. The drive technology development was Adrian's project, but by year 10 it had grown into something that required its own team and its own facility and its own security protocols. The speed at which humanity had agreed to travel through space for 11 years of Accord membership was the equivalent of a long-distance runner agreeing to match pace with the slowest person on a recreational jogging trail. Polite. Cooperative. And a fundamental misrepresentation of what was actually possible. We stopped misrepresenting it. By year 12 of the silence, our fastest vessels were operating at a speed the Accord had no reference point for. Not because the physics were unknown to them. Because they had simply never imagined that any civilization would build engines that capable and then choose not to use them. Cole watched a test flight recording with me from the bridge of the Meridian one afternoon in year 13 and said nothing for a long time after it ended. "How does that look to someone who does not know us?" he said. "Terrifying," I said. "Is that a problem?" I thought about it seriously. "Not anymore," I said. The Davari contact happened in year 14, and it was Lena who made it. Lena Park had been running a long-range scouting mission along the outer rim of charted space, standard Sol compact survey work, cataloging transit routes, when her instruments picked up a signal that was not in any Accord or compact database. She followed it for 6 days through 3 unmapped sectors. What she found was a civilization that had been watching the galactic community from a careful distance for approximately 50 years without once making contact. The Accord's protocol for potential first contact encounters ran to 300 pages. Quarantine. Observation. Classification. Formal committee convening. Assessment period of no less than 18 months before any direct communication was authorized. Lena's approach was considerably shorter. She opened a communication frequency, identified herself in 12 languages including 2 that the Davari had apparently been listening to for decades, and said hello. The Davari responded in 11 minutes. Their lead contact specialist, whom Lena described in her mission report as the most exhaustingly precise individual she had ever spoken to, and Lena had worked alongside me for 14 years, so that was a meaningful comparison, explained that the Davari had been monitoring Accord transmissions for 53 years. They had assessed the Accord 17 times for potential contact viability. 17 times, they had concluded that the power structures within the Accord made contact inadvisable. What had changed was the silence. What the Davari had observed during the review period was a reconfiguration. A species that had been operating within constraints choosing to stop operating within those constraints. A civilization that appeared to be completing itself. They wanted to meet the people responsible. Lena sent me the full transcript with a note attached. The note said, "I told them you were not as impressive in person. They said they would make up their own minds." I included the Davari in the Seoul Compact framework negotiations within 3 months. Owen Dale's reaction when I told him was a long silence followed by a slow exhale followed by him saying, "Do you have any idea how long the Accord has been trying to make contact with the Rim civilizations?" 30 years, I said. "And they have not managed it yet." "Right," Owen said. "Right." By year 25, the Seoul Compact contained 51 species, operated its own transit network across 9 sectors, maintained a security force that had completed 3 independent first contacts, and had developed technologies that the Accord had no current equivalent for. We were not hiding any of it. We were not broadcasting it either. We were simply building, the way you build when you have a plan and the plan is working and no one is asking you to slow down. Grant, who ran our communications monitoring division out of a station near Jupiter's 4th moon, sent me a monthly digest of Accord internal transmissions that a sympathetic Verosi intelligence officer continued to route to us through a channel that had been open since year 2. That officer was DOS. He was not working for us. He had made that clear in his first message. He was working, he said, for the record. He had spent 11 years watching the Accord make the same mistake in progressively larger formats and had decided that someone should be paying attention. His dispatches were precise, detailed, and entirely without commentary. I read every one of them. Year 31's digest contained something that made me read it twice. Then a third time. Then send it to Cole and Adrian and Owen with a single line of my own attached. It begins. An Accord deep-range monitoring probe had drifted off its designated survey path in Sector 12, equipment drift, the kind of minor navigational error that happens to unmaintained hardware over long periods. The probe had entered the outer boundary of Seoul Compact development space near the 4th shipyard. The 4th shipyard was not our largest. It was not our most advanced. It was not the one I would have chosen for the Accord to discover first. The probe's sensors had spent 47 minutes recording before its navigation system corrected the error and returned it to its standard survey path. The data packet it transmitted automatically to the Accord monitoring station contained 47 minutes of footage of a construction facility operating at a scale that the probe's instruments required 3 separate recalibration attempts to measure correctly. The data packet reached the Accord monitoring authority 6 months later. The duty officer who processed it filed an automatic status report and then, 6 minutes later, filed an emergency escalation request. The escalation went directly to Chairman Arev's office. Grant sent me the escalation notice with a small note at the bottom. The note said, "They have seen the room." I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote one line in the notebook, which was by that point the 9th notebook in the series. Year 31. They finally looked. The summit request arrived in year 39. 39 years after the vote. 1 year before the formal end of the review period. The message came through a general diplomatic frequency that had not been used to contact human space in nearly 4 decades. It was 11 paragraphs long. I read it standing up at the communications terminal in my home office in Cornwall, which I had built overlooking a stretch of coastline that I had always found useful for thinking. The message contained 4 apologies and 0 explanations. It used the phrase mutual benefit 11 times. It used the word concern 7 times, always in relation to galactic stability, never in relation to anything the Accord had actually done. I sent back 2 words. On our way. Cole was at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, reading something on his tablet with the focused expression he uses when he is trying to decide whether to say what he is actually thinking. He had retired from the diplomatic division 4 years ago and spent most of his time now on advisory work for the Seoul Compact Education Framework, which he claimed was less stressful and which he clearly did not find less interesting. Summit request, I said. He set the tablet down. When? They want 6 weeks. Cole looked at me for a moment. How many are you bringing? 42 human. Plus the Davari delegation. Plus Owen's contingent from the compact. He was quiet. How many total? He said. 91, I said. Cole picked up his tablet again. I will pack, he said. Nora Pell, who had come out of retirement for this and had been running our pre-summit intelligence work for 3 months, sat across from me on the transit flight and spread 6 files across the table between us with the careful precision of someone who has been waiting a long time to show someone something important. The files were the Accord's internal threat assessment documents for the full review period. Doss had routed the complete archive 6 months ago, timed, he said in his usual brief and exact communication style, for when you will need it most. I read through the files for 4 hours. They were thorough. The Accord had been extraordinarily thorough about their fear. They had modeled 112 scenarios for human behavior during the review period. The models ranged from economic collapse to diplomatic isolation failure to internal political fracture. They had modeled resource conflicts, population decline, cultural stagnation, and what one document called civilizational contraction under sustained exclusion pressure. Not one of the 112 models had considered that we would do what we did. Not one. There was a supplementary file attached to the main assessment. A single page. Filed in year 27 of the review period by a junior analyst named Peter Vane, who had subsequently left the Accord Intelligence Service and whose current location was listed as unknown. The file was titled, Alternate Scenario, Unmodeled Development Trajectory. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described, with considerable precision, almost exactly what we had done. The second paragraph said, this scenario was considered by this analyst to be the most probable outcome and was removed from the active modeling suite by senior review on the grounds that it was not strategically useful to plan for. I read that second paragraph several times. Not strategically useful to plan for. I showed it to Nora. She read it once. They knew, she said. One of them knew, I said. That is different. Is it? I thought about that for most of the remaining journey. The Accord station looked the same from the outside. Larger in a few places, new construction rings added in years 20 and 31, both funded partially by assessments on transit corridor usage that had increased in cost significantly after the piracy surges in the Kellyan lanes. I knew the cost increase figure. It was in Diana's archive. We docked without incident. The security team that met us in the arrival corridor was not Verosi. I noticed that first. Then I noticed what it was. A mixed team of species I did not immediately recognize, in Accord security uniforms, moving with the particular controlled care of people who have been given very specific instructions about this particular arrival. Doss was not among them. I had not expected him to be. His last message, sent 2 weeks before our departure from Earth, had been 6 lines long by his standards. It said that he had retired from Accord service in year 36. That he was currently working as an independent liaison for a research institution. That he would be at the summit in an unofficial capacity. And that in his professional opinion, which he acknowledged I had not asked for, the council was more frightened than they were letting the summit briefing document suggest. I had written one reply. Thank you, Doss. I know. The chamber was the same room. Same dimensions. Same environmental hum. Same curved gallery. It felt simultaneously familiar and wrong, the way a room feels when you have been away long enough for the furniture to have moved and then moved back, almost but not quite to its original position. 91 of us walked in. The Accord delegations had arrived before us and were already seated. 11 species at the primary table. Chairman Arev, older, his membrane a slightly more muted version of the copper and blue tone that Thren develop in advanced middle age, watched me come through the door, and his membrane shifted through 3 colors in 2 seconds: recognition, calculation, and the very faint gray-green that I had only seen twice before in Thren chromatic vocabulary. Gray-green meant something close to dread. He recognized what he was looking at. Not just me. All 91 of us. The Davari delegation, who moved with the careful deliberateness of people who have spent decades deciding whether a room was worth walking into and had concluded, in this case, that it was. Owen Dale and his contingent, representing 44 of the Sol Compact's 51-member species, carrying the particular quiet confidence of people who had spent 40 years building something and were now prepared to show it. The Kreth delegate, not the same one as 39 years ago, but from the same station and with the same quality of absolute stillness, looked at the Davari and then looked at me, and his stillness changed. It was the same kind of change as smoke when a window opens. Very slight. Very telling. I took the seat at the primary table directly across from Chairman Arev. I put my notebook on the table. The same notebook. The first one. The cover was worn smooth at the corners. Arev looked at it. I watched him look at it. Ambassador Voss, he said. His translator rendered the formal Thren address. The Council welcomes the human delegation and its guests. Its guests. I noticed that phrase. Precise, diplomatic, and a careful avoidance of naming the Sol Compact directly. Thank you, Chairman, I said. We appreciate the invitation. Before we proceed to formal agenda items, Arev said, the Council wishes to acknowledge that the review period has produced certain outcomes that were not fully anticipated when the motion was originally passed. I waited. The Council is prepared to discuss reintegration of the human delegation into the Accord on revised terms. I waited. We believe that reintegration would benefit the broader galactic community, Arev continued. I waited a little longer. The chamber was quiet. The Davari delegation was perfectly still. Owen Dale, 2 seats to my left, was looking at a point on the table approximately 18 inches in front of him with the expression of a person counting very slowly in their head. With respect, Chairman, I said, we are not here to discuss reintegration. The color shift in Arev's membrane was visible to everyone who knew to look for it. Gray-green deepening toward charcoal. Then perhaps the ambassador would clarify the purpose of this meeting, he said. I opened the notebook. We are here to discuss the terms of a new framework, I said. Not reintegration into an existing structure but the construction of a different one. The Sol Compact has 44 member species, 9 operational sectors, an independent transit network, and a technological development program that the Accord currently has no equivalent for. We are prepared to sit at a table with the Accord. We are prepared to cooperate, share, and build something together. We are not prepared to sit at a table where any species can be told by a majority vote to go away and be quiet for 40 years while others decide what to do about them. Silence. The Accord's founding charter contains an expulsion provision, I continued. We want it removed. We want a replacement mechanism that requires direct dialogue and transparent negotiation for any dispute between member civilizations. We want the transit corridor protocols restructured so that no single coalition can use access control as a political instrument. And we want the archive. The Sullivan delegate leaned forward. What archive? The one we have been building for 39 years, I said. A full documented record of every unattributed contribution, every suppressed development, every quiet service rendered to this community by species the Accord classified as secondary participants. It will be released publicly regardless of how this negotiation concludes. It is not a threat. It is a record. The galaxy deserves an accurate one. The room held its breath. A junior Vorin delegate in the 4th row, young, with the faintly iridescent skin patterns of a Vorin who had not yet reached full adulthood by their species reckoning, raised a thin hand. I nodded at the delegate. What exactly? The delegate said, and the voice was not hostile, not challenging, just genuinely and plainly uncertain in the way that people are when they are confronted with a gap between what they thought they knew and what they are currently looking at. What exactly have you built out there? The chamber went very still. I looked at the delegate for a moment. Everything, I said, that you assumed we would not. Negotiations ran for 11 days. I will not pretend they were easy. 11 days of sustained, structured, high-stakes conversation with 11 species who had spent 39 years in varying states of relief, unease, and, in the final years, as the evidence accumulated, something closer to slow-building alarm. Some of them had arrived expecting to manage us. Some had arrived expecting to be managed by us. A small number, and I noticed them by the particular quality of their attention, had arrived expecting to have a real conversation. Those were the ones who moved the process forward. The first 3 days were procedural, framework arguments, authority questions, who spoke for whom and in what format. Owen Dale handled most of this with the methodical patience of someone who had been negotiating foundational structures for 20 years and had a deeply embedded allergy to shortcuts. Owen did not cut corners. He had once spent 4 hours on the precise definition of a single term in a subclause of a resource-sharing agreement. At the time I had found it extremely trying. I had since come to understand that those 4 hours were the reason the agreement had held for 17 years without a single dispute. I let Owen run the procedural days. I read the full Accord response to the archive summary, a 20-page document that used the phrase contextual inaccuracy 14 times and the phrase alternative interpretation 11 times and never once used the word wrong. I read the CREF Economic Delegation's private assessment of the Seoul Compact Transit Network, which had been routed to me through the same channel DOS used and which I was fairly certain the CREF delegate had not intended to be readable by human eyes. It was a thorough assessment. It concluded that the Compact's network was already structurally superior to the Accords in 3 of the 9 sectors it covered. The CREF delegate knew what we had built. He had known for some time. I put the assessment in the notebook and did not mention it at the table. On day 4, I asked to meet with DOS privately. He was waiting for me in a small corridor meeting room 3 levels below the main chamber that smelled of recycled air and old materials and the staleness of a space used for conversations that people do not want overheard. DOS had always been large, but he seemed somehow more settled now than he had 39 years ago, like a structure that has found its permanent position and stopped adjusting. He was wearing civilian clothes. Off-white, practical, the kind of outfit that communicates nothing and is therefore its own kind of statement. "You look well," I said. "You look exactly the same," he said. Virosi do not have the same range of facial expression as humans, but there is a specific set of micromovements around their orbital plates that functions as a dry and quiet form of humor. He was doing it now. "I wanted to thank you," I said. "For the transmissions." "They were not a gift," he said. "They were a function." "I know. Thank you anyway." He was quiet in the particular Virosi way, which has a texture to it, a kind of present weight. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You can ask," he said. In the threat assessment files. Year 27. The analyst who filed the alternate scenario, the one that described what we actually did. He was removed from the program. Yes. Do you know why? Truly why, not the official reason. DOS's orbital plates shifted. Because the model he constructed required the assessors to consider that human civilization was not in decline during the review period. The senior staff had built the entire strategic framework of the period around a particular outcome. They needed you to be diminishing. When one analyst suggested you were not, the model was incompatible with the framework. So they removed the model. I sat with that. They chose the framework over the evidence, I said. They chose the story they had already told themselves, DOS said. In my experience, it is the most common failure there is. I thought about the Voron colonial dead. About the piracy surges in the Kellyan lanes. About 18 months of xenolinguistics work done in circles around a file that was 3 keywords away from a solution we had catalogued a decade before. "Are you afraid," DOS said, "of what this new framework becomes?" I looked at him. "Are you asking if I am afraid we become them?" I said. "I am asking if the concern has occurred to you." "Every day since year 8, I said. "Good," he said. He stood up. "That concern is the correct one to carry." He left. I sat in the empty room for a while, thinking about the kind of person who builds a room and whether the room eventually decides what kind of person you are. On day 6, the Davari ambassador addressed the full chamber for the first time. Her name, rendered into accessible language by our translator system, was something close to Vera, though the Davari version of it carried resonances that no translation could fully capture. She was small by most species standards, precise in her movements, with a quality of stillness that was different from the CREF delegate's stillness. Where the CREF delegate was still the way something under pressure is still, Vera was still the way something that has already made a decision is still. She spoke for 17 minutes. She described 53 years of Davari observation. The recordings they had made. The assessments they had run, not unlike the Accords, she said, but with a different conclusion at the end. She described the 17 times the Davari had concluded that Accord contact was inadvisable. She described what those conclusions were based on. She was not diplomatic about it. She described a community that had built its identity around a particular hierarchy of civilizational value and that had used the tools of formal governance to enforce that hierarchy on species that had never agreed to it. She was not speaking in anger. That was the part that made it land the way it did. She was speaking the way someone speaks when they're describing something they have had 53 years to think about carefully and have finally found the right room to say out loud. We made contact with humanity, she said, because we saw something in the silence that we had not seen before. A civilization completing itself. Not performing restraint. Not performing compliance. Becoming what it actually is. We found that to be a reliable signal of the kind of neighbor worth having. The chamber was extremely quiet. The Sullivan delegate in the upper gallery, whose species produces a low-frequency vibration when processing significant information, barely audible but present, was vibrating. Chairman Arev's membrane had gone through 7 color shifts in 17 minutes. I had tracked all of them. The final one, as Vera finished and returned to her seat, was a color I had only seen twice before in research texts on advanced Thren chromatic vocabulary. It was the color of an idea that cannot be put back. The archive went public on day 9. Diana Fenn had prepared the release with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Clean organization. Full documentation. Every unattributed human contribution with complete sourcing and evidence trail. Every suppressed development. Every service rendered in silence. Every loss in the gap where human infrastructure had been and then had not. The Vorin number was in there. 18 names. Not just a count. Names, ages, colony designation, and the specific response equipment that had arrived 18 hours too late. I had insisted on the names. The archive did not editorialize. It did not frame. It did not argue. It presented the record and allowed the record to speak in its own voice, which turned out to be loud enough. By day 10, the release had been accessed by research institutions on 6 Accord worlds and 14 Sol Compact worlds. 3 independent press agencies had published summaries. The Accord's official communications office had issued a response describing the archive as selectively compiled, which was technically accurate in the same way that a painting of the ocean is technically just paint. Adrian brought me the response statement over coffee. Selectively compiled, he read aloud. Yes, I said. What is the selection criterion? Things that happened, I said. He put the statement down. The human members of my delegation had been patient for 9 days. They were people who had spent a very long time building something and who were now in the same room as the people who had told them to go sit in the corner, and patience in that context is a discipline, not a natural state. On the evening of day 10, Owen Dale came to find me in the corridor meeting room I had adopted as a private workspace and put a single document on the table in front of me. Counter-proposal from the Kreth Economic Bloc, he said. They want punitive access fees on Sol Compact transit lanes for the first 15 years of any new framework. I read it. No, I said. It is a negotiating position, Owen said. We could consider. No, I said again. We are not starting a new framework with a punishment built into the foundation. Whatever they did, we are not doing that. Owen looked at me steadily. They removed us from the council for 40 years. Yes, I said. And we spent those 40 years becoming something that does not do that. I am not abandoning that on day 10 because the Kreth want to feel like they won something. Owen was quiet for a moment. If we build this the right way, I said, there is no winning and losing in it. There is just the structure. And the structure holds or it does not hold based on whether it was built on something real. Owen picked up the counterproposal and folded it precisely in half. I will draft a rejection with alternative provisions, he said. Thank you, I said. Yara. I looked up. What do we do, he said, if they will not agree to remove the expulsion clause? I had been thinking about this since year 2 of the silence, when I first understood that the expulsion provision was not a safety valve in the Accord's structure but a load-bearing wall. Then we do not join the revised Accord, I said. We maintain the compact. We operate in parallel. We keep every door open and we build the kind of track record over time that makes the expulsion clause look like what it is, a structural failure, until enough member species decide to remove it themselves. Owen considered this. That could take another 40 years. We are good at long timelines, I said. He almost smiled. Owen Dale almost smiling was the diplomatic equivalent of fireworks. Day 11. The final session. I will remember it not for the arguments or the provisions or the procedural language that took 4 hours to finalize into its precise form. I will remember it for the 10 minutes before the vote when the room went quiet in a real way, not a political silence, not a performance of waiting, but the genuine quiet of a large group of very different beings who had all arrived at the same moment and were understanding, in their various ways, exactly what it meant. The revised framework removed the expulsion provision. It added a mandatory direct negotiation clause requiring any dispute to be worked through transparent bilateral and multilateral channels before any restrictive action could be taken. It restructured transit corridor protocols. It created an attribution process for joint projects. It established a permanent independent archive commission with representation from every member civilization. The compact's terms. All of them. Every single one. The vote was called. 14 species, the original 11 Accord members and 3 sole compact representatives seated at the primary table under the new framework's provisional terms, voted in favor. I sat with my hand on the table and my pen on the notebook and did not raise it. Not in protest. Not in defiance. Not as a statement about the past. The motion did not require our vote. The numbers were already there without us. For the first time in the history of the Accord, a foundational decision had passed without humanity's participation being necessary. That was the point. That was what 40 years had built. Not the loudest voice in the room. The room itself. After the session ended, I stayed in the chamber while the other delegations moved toward the reception that Arev's office had organized. Cole stayed with me. We sat at the primary table in the slowly emptying room and said nothing for a while. The environmental hum was the only sound. The lighting shifted slowly through its evening cycle the way it always had, indifferent to everything that had just been decided beneath it. "How do you feel?" Cole said eventually. I thought about it carefully, because it was a serious question and Cole had earned a serious answer. "Like someone who spent 40 years carrying something heavy," I said, "and has just put it down. Not because the weight broke me. Because I reached the place I was carrying it to." Cole nodded slowly. "What do you do now?" he said. "Go home," I said. "Write the last entry. Sleep for approximately 1 week. And after that." I picked up the notebook. Turn to the last page with writing on it. Turn to the next blank page. Wrote one final line. Then I capped the pen and placed it in my pocket and stood up from the table where I had sat 39 years ago and told 11 species to enjoy the quiet. After that, I said, "We see what we built." I walked out of the chamber. Through the corridor with the environmental hum. Past the security station where a new officer I did not know gave me a formal nod. Through the departure hall where Lena was already running pre-flight checks with the focused expression she wore when she was ready to move and waiting for the rest of us to catch up. "Ready," she said. "Ready," I said. I sat in my command chair and looked out through the bridge screen at the station. Enormous. Lit with the light of many worlds. A structure that was, in small and undocumented ways that would now be documented, partly ours. The station began to shrink as Lena brought us away from the docking ring with that particular quality of motion she had always had, purposeful, precise, no wasted movement. The lights of the station faded in the same order they had faded 39 years ago, large to small, complex to simple, until there was only a point of light and then nothing at all. I opened the notebook for the last time and read the final entry I had just written. Year 39, Day 11. They called it a quiet era. 40 years of silence. 11 species exhaling with relief in a chamber. For decades of the universe continuing without us, or so they thought. They were so busy listening for us to disappear that they never heard us arriving. We were never quiet. We were building. Log closed.